Hello, everyone. My name is Srimoyee Mitra, and I'm the director of Stamps Gallery, part of Penny W. Stamps School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. Stamps Gallery is an incubator and lab for contemporary artists and designers to explore ideas and projects that catalyze positive social change. Building on the school's strong tradition of excellence, thought leadership, and community engagement, our goal is to develop innovative and scholarly exhibitions, publications, and public programs that foster inclusive platforms for presentation, discussion, and inquiry into the urgent questions and concerns of our time. A commitment to social justice shapes our work, developing exhibitions, programs, and publications that inspire new ways of looking, making, and thinking. It is my honor to welcome you all today for the program Raqs Media Collective in conversation with Gunalan Nadarajan, organized by Stamps Gallery in partnership with Expo Chicago and generously supported by the Andy Warhol Foundation. While we convene across geographical locations and time zones, I would like to start by offering our gratitude and acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, and Wyandot, where Stamps Gallery and the University of Michigan are located. As the COVID-19 pandemic has proliferated across the globe, radically transforming everyday life and mobility, it has laid bare the urgency to grapple with the deep roots of racial and colonial violence in the US and abroad. Stamps Gallery invited and commissioned Raqs Media Collective to develop new videos to examine the far-reaching impact of the pandemic on contemporary life and relations from personal and societal levels. It resulted in a suite of powerful videos entitled The Pandemic Circle that premiered on December 1st, 2020, and is available on our website, which is stamps.umich.edu/exhibitions. So we are here today to hear from the artists Jibesh Bagchi, Monica Narula, and Shuddhabrata Sengupta, who comprise Raqs Media Collective, about the making of these new works, as they will be in conversation with Gunalan Nadarajan, Dean of Stamps School of Art and Design, and who has collaborated with them on numerous conferences and curated their work at the Ogaki Biennial in Japan in 2006. They have shared a multi-decade-long friendship, and it is my pleasure to bring them back here today for what promises to be an insightful conversation. So welcome, Guna, Shuddha, Monica, and Jibesh. I will now briefly introduce them with their bios, and then we will start hearing from them. So Raqs Media Collective, formed in 1992, and comprises of Monica Narula, Jibesh Bagchi, and Shuddhabrata Sengupta. And they argue for a mode of kinetic contemplation that rides a restless entanglement with the world. This translates into working with moving images in ways that unsettle the ordering of space and time through timelines, lifelines, latitudes, and longitudes. Raqs practices across several media, including installation, sculpture, video, performance, text, and lexica. From 2000 to 2013, Raqs has spent time at Sarai, which they co-founded with CSDS in North Delhi, and where they were also members of the editorial collegiate, the Sarai Reader Series. Raqs's work has been shown in museums and exhibitions across the world, including Documenta 11, Venice, Istanbul, Sydney, Shanghai, and Sao Paulo biennials, and in solo exhibitions at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi, Tate Modern London, UNAM, Mexico City, Foundation Proa Buenos Aires, Whitworth Art Gallery, Manchester, K21 Dusseldorf, and Mathaf in Doha, amongst others. Curatorial projects by Raqs includes The Rest of Now, Manifesta 8, 2011, Sarai Reader 09, Devi Art Foundation in Gurgaon, 2012, 5 Million Incidents at the Goethe Institute, Delhi and Calcutta, 2019 to 2020, and their most recent Afterglow, the Yokohama Triennial in 2020. Welcome, Raqs. Gunalan Nadarajan is an art theorist and curator working at the intersections of art, science, and technology. He is Dean and Professor at the Penny W. Stamps School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. His writings have been translated into 16 languages. He is on the editorial board of the book series Technicities, Edinburgh University Press. He has curated many international exhibitions, including Ambulations in Singapore, 1999, Media City, Seoul, 2002, Transmediale 05 in Berlin, ICEA 2006 in San Jose, and Future Everything Festival, Manchester, 2009. He was artistic director of the Ogaki Biennale in 2006 in Japan and the artistic director of ICEA 2008 in Singapore. He is active in the development of media arts internationally and has previously served on the board of the Inter-Society of Electronic Art, is on the advisory board of the Database of Virtual Art Austria, Cells Button Festival Indonesia, the New Media Caucus, and was an advisor on creative programs of digital culture to the UNESCO and the Smithsonian Institution. Welcome, Guna. So without further ado, we look forward to your conversation.
Thank you, Srimoyee. And welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And it's great to be here with Raqs Media Collective, friends, colleagues I've known and admired for many, many years. And it's a privilege to be in conversation with you and to share that experience with all of you today. I wanted to quickly get to the questions. We'll spend about 30 minutes in conversation, and then we'll have about between 10, 15, hopefully maybe even 20 minutes of opportunities for audience to raise questions through the chat. So here we are. I'll fire away, Raqs. As all of you know, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on the arts, on artists and the ability to continue making, and on arts organizations, large and small, and their institutional viability. I've spoken to many artists from across the world about the challenges that they are facing on an everyday basis to make work, to create, to sustain themselves. With that context of the stasis and paralysis that has been induced by the pandemic on the life of artists, your work, the Pandemic Circle, Raqs, I feel seems to be both a kind of a defiant act of creation as well as a meditation on how and what calls upon one to continue making and living. So could you speak to the motives that moved you to create this work amidst this pandemic?
Thank you, Guna. So always there is a little bit of queuing problem between us. So I can take the first shot and then my colleagues will do the run. I think one of the most important, I saw the three works, though the last two has been working for the last only 2 months, but saw them together today and realized that they are kind of a way of almost inscribing yourself back into your life in a certain kind of giving yourself a coherence of a passage of time that you experienced bodily in a somatic level, because every sensorium was withdrawn from you, but you experienced an intensity that was not known to you before. So in that sense, this works became a part of almost like a storytelling to each other, that how we existed between each other. So these are in a way that they look very, there is always a question that how does a collective writes itself into to each other. So the writing, though there is a one hand sometimes changing the contours and sometimes the finger impressions, but the idea is the texts are something that flowed between us in some ways, so continuously. So it's a kind of also imprints of those texts that are continuously getting remembered and locked by someone between us. So there is a flow and there is a locking, there is a flow. So in that sense, this is a work that became part of our way of making sense and also rendering this time in some kind of public way to each other, and then to our friend circles, to people who are more and more growing in a different way, in a different level. We'll come back to Monica and Shraddha.
I mean, it's, what you're saying, Guna, is really real, right? I think a lot of us have this suddenly the fact that, for a collective who was meeting every day for at least a few hours a day, we didn't see each other's face physically for many, many months. Only recently have we sort of braved going out once in a while again to be in the studio together. And so this question of, as Jibesh said, so the relationship with technology, of course, we've all ruminated on the fact, we've all survived because of this, the business of writing to each other. But what is interesting, and is the sort of the handwriting also implies that there is a kind of second order of reflection on what has been shared. So this is also what we were interested in. There's a work of ours, which we made some years ago, called Corrections to the First Draft of History. What the sort of the central idea, or the sort of takeoff point from that was, so it's work that works on newspapers. So the newspaper people call newspaper the first draft of history, right? So we worked with blackboard paint and rewriting on that, and writing on the blackboard paint, and said, so we are making correction to the first draft of history. But what was interesting for us in that process also was the fact that while we were sort of looking at histories of primers that have been used, especially in the Bengal, for teaching writing to children, or not to children, but also across language. That was the crucial thing.
Learning English from Bengali.
Between English, from Bengali to English. What was interesting for us was not just the point of writing because you can on another level and just say, well, this history is inadequate, we need to make corrections to it. But like we said, if you see the piece, what we also talk about is the first book of writing, which sort of lays out the terrain, and then the second book of writing, which is that then you have to ask, what is it that you are correcting with? What is it that you're writing afresh? What is it that you are able to say, which is not only of the order of saying, I'm erasing and writing because I can, which is, of course, a very important first act. But then the second act becomes, I think, a kind of different point of reflection. And for us, I think in this making of the pandemic circle, this was a big part of that. I mean, texts shared, or voice messages, or phone conversations, gleanings from newspapers, things that arrived at your door from multiple but what you transmitted to each other and how it got written and then rewritten. And in that sense, trying to find SAR, the kind of the essence of what this moment is. And as you can see from the three films, the first one is a kind of iterating the moment, right? Trying to find vignettes that one, of course, writing also gives you a moment of control. You can actually, that moment of inscription has its own physical kind of, contentment or pleasure, but also then that was the first part of it. But then after that, the second one becomes reflective on that thing itself. It says, now that I know what I'm seeing, what are my feelings about it, and then how am I dealing with those feelings? So then it becomes only the next kind of moment. And the third one, kind of like, like a Nautilus, like, it spirals into the next kind of situation, which is that now that I know that things have happened and what I have felt with, and what I'm trying to deal with my feelings, the question then is, how do I look at how I am in the world and how I read that, what is the porous relationship between ourselves, and the multiple selves, not just the collective self, but multiple selves and the world outside.
Well, I mean, I'll just add one little thing, which is that also during these months, we worked towards and then finally opened the Yokohama Triennial, of which we were the curators. And it was the first major international art event to open during and stay open during the pandemic. And I think it was quite remarkable to think about what that meant as an insistence, and not to be foolhardy, and wasn't an exercise in any kind of bravado, because they were very carefully arrived at protocols about how people would be present. But the kind of emphasis, and I think that there's a certain kind of stoicism in Japan about getting on with life, which is quite interesting, perhaps as a result of a long exposure to catastrophe as a fact of life, but which then meant that it gave us an opportunity to rethink the role and the idea of why we make art. I mean, the one thing you don't do in a pandemic is that you cut down on all the things that are unnecessary. Yeah. Perhaps that leaves you with a space to think about what is desired, and art is, the realm of desire in a sense. So it'll take time for us for this thought to sink in, for us to understand the significance of what insisting on an international art event like a triennial during the time of the pandemic was, but it happened, and it happened in miraculous and beautiful and marvelous ways.
And Guna, I'll just add, there was another thing which was about 30 artists in Delhi and around and other cities for the 5 million incident that we did. So there was a huge program that we were doing with 100 artists that kind of collapsed in March onwards in Delhi. So they all bravely, and with aid of some very bright young designers and artists, went online and did fabulous works over the period of time intensively for 10 days, but they built up a platform. So the thing is that artists, like we say in one of the interviews which is going to come out tomorrow, artists have shown immense resilience and intelligence and creative dynamism. It is now the turn of institution to show it.
That's well put. The right word is resilience and persistence, and not cowing to the fact that this is having an impact on us and is just driving us sometimes even crazy with the way it isolates us. And so I want to take you up on the question of writing, and Jivesh, you talked about this idea of re-inscribing yourself back into your life, and Monica, you talked about this idea of writing that gives you control in some ways, right? That it provides you with that control back and wresting the control back in some ways, and again it goes back to this question that we talked about just now, that resilience is what drives us forward, that what moves us, what makes us move forward. So I want to talk a bit, to get a chance to have you talk a bit about the place of writing a little bit. So I followed your work for more than 2 decades now, and I was before this conversation, I was thinking, where have I seen them using calligraphy, especially cursive writing, in your works? And I was looking back at your prolific range of works, and I did not manage to, of course, get through all of them, but this work cursive writing and the calligraphic form is very integral to the work itself, to all three videos. And so, as many of us who share a kind of a colonial history of schooling in cursive writing might attest to, this form of writing with its focus on fluid strokes and joints is both a kind of disciplining of writing, even as it pretends to be a freeing of our hands to express writing as art. So in all your works, the cursive writing figures prominently. I also found the focus on the slow writing of the text in all the videos to conjure up an image, where, because the text, the written text refers to perhaps an image or conjures an image in our minds or an experience, while simultaneously there is at the background or side by side, there is this simultaneous pixelating of the accompanying image that is gradual but obfuscating what is behind it. And what it did to me, at least, and it might be what you intended, that is a kind of way in which that written text and the writing provided an opportunity and forced me to have a kind of an extreme attentiveness to what was going on. It is noteworthy that cursive writing today is returning to classrooms, purportedly because of its ability to increase the reciprocity between producing, the actual making and the producing and the writing, and the comprehension that comes, one presumes, after, but usually in this written form, it seems psychologists are saying it is much tighter, that connection between producing and comprehending. And something that is lost. Many of us who have migrated into digital writing with the keyboard have hardly been able to get back to writing. So the repetitive cadences of cursive writing in your work, with its jumps and starts, its pauses, its hesitations, its smudges, and sometimes its leaky endings, seems to be a kind of an invitation to the audience, to the viewer, to linger with the writer and to linger with the experience. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the role of writing writ large in your work, and more specifically cursive writing in this form. And I know that language itself is a very important part of your work. So could you maybe speak also about, by inference, how language figures in this particular work and your broader work essay?
Guna, while you are speaking, an image flashed. We were doing a international exhibition in Delhi in 2014 January. The Delhi January, it's beautiful sun, and it was a very hectic. It was with small group of artists, 25 artists, but it was very hectic because it had to be done in Delhi, and there was a lot of difficulties of producing contemporary art with a certain complexity. So it was summer sun, and Monica would be sitting there and knitting, and would be knitting every day. And few of my artist friends would burst out laughing. But what happened was that we will sit around her knitting and chat with peanuts, and we'd be all chatting. Kind of became a resting place to the exhibitionary hecticness. So I think you have to look at that writing as that point of the knitting. It's that place where you sit. It's a la pausa in football, which I keep on telling my friends. The great skill to learn in football is called the la pausa, which you just pause and it disrupt for yourself the speed in which you are. So very few players have that, and since Maradona died, we can go back to football because people will remember. So there is a kind of high momentum around you, and then you learn the art of just dropping dead, standing dead, and disrupting the rhythms of other, and finding in you and with your playmates another rhythm. So it's like that. It's that finding that la pausa moment for yourself with each other. For me, that act was that. I'm sure Monica and Shraddha, it is better because I come from football and knitting, so it's a different.
I wish you were not doing the knitting. Let it be said. I think this.
Monica was doing
some
the
of these
knitting.
things actually, you've spoken really. You've spoken very eloquently, I think, of what the and I think raised more things than perhaps one is not always aware of all the things that that are part of why you do something. I mean, you only discover perhaps later. But I think some things were the idea of repetition, or the fact, which is the other thing about just such as knitting, and all I can knit is a muffler because it is a repetition. I can't knit a jumper because that's too complicated. But the thing about the fact that there is a kind of, it is about the changing of the rhythm. It is about reiteration. It is about the idea of like literalizing the idea of riyaz or practice, in which it is that the repetitionness of that is part of the, and of course some would argue that it is to make it better handwriting. But one could also say that it is just about creating moments of stillness, which we've talked about. But I think this business of, I mean, I remember being taught cursive writing in school, and of course we are all of that. But I remember being told that it would be super efficient in writing in your exams because you could write really fast. So there's a very different sales technique that was taught to us. But I do know, of course, that the English that we speak. Definitely the pronunciation that we are, that is considered, the received pronunciation is also part of colonial empire, because how else will, people in other places understand the English of someone from Manchester or someone from Leeds, or, there's so many Englishes. So there are histories that are obviously, but I think what Jibesh is sort of raising, I think, is where, and also I think it was just very important to change materiality. I think the fact that we were living so much with screens, right? The screen it's the one stop for everything, sociality and recipes and, whatever you wanted to do, and entertainment and work. And there was nothing. This was the window, and I'm very grateful for that window. But to change both rhythm but also materiality was part of that, I think. And as you said, I think when you write, you think differently. I mean, as psychologists are pointing out, that taking notes when you're writing is a more efficient way of remembering. So I think this point of what is it that one seeks to remember? So you write down what you think is a moment that has to be, remembered. So memory and an interruption of memory too, I suppose.
Well, I mean, just to take that question of memory further, because I think handwriting is one of the most intensely muscular processes that we undertake. If you think about what it means to write with precision, you're actually, one of the bones that nobody thinks about is the shoulder joint, and that's very involved in handwriting. We think it's only the carpals and metacarpals, but handwriting, which is why your hands ache, your arms ache when you write a lot, and that has to do with the activity of the upper and upper arm bones. And it's interesting to think of why there is this desire to make the precise mark, and I think it's a very, very old desire. Colonialism may have had a role to play in turning that desire in certain directions, but it's a much older desire. I mean, I've been of late really fascinated by the traces of the Neanderthal in us, because we all carry it to different degrees. And one of the oldest artifacts with precise markings that I know of is a raven's bone with 7 notches that are carved on it, which is from a Neanderthal site, and it's between 43 to 38,000 years old. Now, there is no possible functional reason as to why somebody would have spent their time carving those 7 notches. And a detailed analysis of the notches shows that 2 of the notches were added later so as to produce a greater regularity between the notches. So some mind 40,000 years ago was spending their time trying to create a regular pattern of lines on a small surface. If you look at the 3rd video, the hand that that draws the vertical line, insisting, is in a sense trying to fill space and yet create space, because every line and every other line is an expansion of space. And I think that that kind of way of thinking about space and about regularity and rhythm is a very, very old and a very deep desire. And I know this because, you know, Jibesh has football as his reference. I'm left-handed. It was extremely painful for me to be able to write well. And it was a personal ambition when I was a little boy. It wasn't the teacher getting me to write well. It was me trying not to write with a smudge, because our desks were the wrong way around for left-handed kids, right? So to be able to write on the paper with precision, not in an ugly form, and to be able to think as one wrote, which I think is a really old desire. And in our part of the world, there are traditions of writing as almost as a ritual exercise every day. There are many people, for instance, Sikhs, you know, the farmers who are protesting around Delhi, many of them begin their day by making a mark called the Ek Omkar on a piece of paper. Or in our part, in Jibesh and our ancestors write something called the Namavali, which is that they keep writing the same name again and again and again. People fill entire fat ledgers with just one name, because that's an act of remembering Allah or or a deity. And these are ways in which you actually like your muscles do the thinking and your muscles do the meditation, and the entire neuromuscular corpus enters into the act of writing a very small name, which is, you know well that in our part of the world, people do crazy things like write the name of God 1,000 times in a grain of rice.
You used to do,
you know, to get into the Guinness Book of Records. And it's a particular obsession, for instance, in parts of South India, the grain of rice with 1,000 words for God. Why? I mean, it must be saying something about the desire to achieve a mastery in a very small scale, in a kind of cosmic way. And that's, I mean, I keep coming back to thinking why the pandemic forced us to think about handwriting, why isolation made us go back to one of the earliest tools. Remember that one of the great enemies of handwriting was Socrates, because he said, if you write, you will forget, which is true. But that is why we write, because we allow ourselves a little bit of amnesia in order to perpetuate a memory on a surface that is not inside ourselves. A friend of mine is currently in prison for very foolish reasons, because the state is repressive and putting people in prison because of what they think. He has been having a running battle on the reading of the jail manual because he wants a sharp pencil to be able to write. And the consistent sort of notes between his lawyer and the jailer and the court about not a blunt pencil, but a sharp pencil. And I think this is, he doesn't, you know, you could say, why does he need a pencil? He needs a pencil because he wants to write. Why does he need to write? He says, well, I don't have to give a reason as to why I want to write something. And that's what handwriting, I think, means right now, is that it means us getting back to our Neanderthal ancestors. It means getting back to the practice of writing the cosmic and the infinite in a grain of rice. And it means training our muscles well.
Thanks, Shridhar, Monica and Jibesh. Now, one last question before we open it up to questions from the audience. So, I know one of the continuing themes of your works, and one we share in common, and pardon the pun, is the notion of commons. The idea that there are forms of being together that engender greater levels of empowerment and joint pursuit of collectively evolved and defined ideals. Essentially exploring different kinds of being together. In the Pandemic Circle works, all three works, there is this at least one witnesses this meditative attention and deliberation on the paralytic restlessness that is induced by the social isolation on the individual subject. For example, the I in the work in the 24/7 video. In this work, the I is repetitively and cumulatively marking their subjective experiences by saying, I am marking my feelings, I am masking my feelings, I am guarding my feelings, etc. So I was reminded of a work that I really enjoyed. I did not see it, but I really enjoyed the premise of it and how you went about it. A recent work of yours, Pemphilos, that you did in 2019. You completed it and showed it in Athens, where you elaborate a bit on your on this theme of commons. So you enact, I think, a masterful conjugation of two kinds of excavations. One of the site of the shipwreck of Antikythera, and the other, the Greek idea of Pemphilos, this notion of friendship for all that was inscribed in one of the objects excavated during the Antikythera excavations. So you seek in that work, in the Pemphilos work, you seek to make a connection between the excavation of the Antikythera shipwreck in the depths of the ocean and stories of people who and I quote, people who specialize in widely different things and yet tend to the shipwreck of the everyday. I love that. Who dive down to the depths of each new day and then come up for air. As part of the work, you spoke to and shared conversations with teachers, poets, migrants, nurses, lawyers, and pharmacists to identify ways of developing that commons, that elusive friendship for all. So how do you see us recovering from this pandemic that might be forcing us all into these bubbles of safety and of convenience? How do you see yourself imagining and connecting ourselves out from the pandemic that frustrates our wish for conviviality to different kinds of being together? I'm really asking you to think about how do we come out of this pandemic in some ways, still retaining that intrigue, that interest, that fascination with the other, and still finding ways to enact those connections that are real and important to all of us, to build those commons.
Guna, thanks for referring back to Pemphilos and the Antarctica. One of the things that in the third video is that it's underwater. The whole video is underwater. What you write dissolves. Even the lines are continuously dissolving. So the idea was water is now this underwater sea that we all experience is one area of the commons, still staying in the language or in the argument of the commons. After the international territories, the underwater is still the commons, like the air is still the commons. So one of the things is to be in that underwater is also to refer back to the idea of something that is profoundly in common, but which is not recognized in common, in the sense that it is so pervasive, like air. So while working underwater, we realized that it is so pervasive, it is like forgetting it, and that's the forgetting of air. So the work is about, and in the third video we'll see that it is you start getting so turned by the whole everyday life churning onto you that you even forget the commonness of the air that we are part of. So there is the common, but common now is no longer for us a space to be asserted or to be argued. So in our curatorial practice also, it has become the ground, the infrastructural, the spreading out, the logic, how to keep on building up structures curatorially that keeps on expanding and bringing more and more people into the fold with an ease. Or in the work, the idea that this whole, some kind of ecology or some kind of space that we share in common as we keep on observing it, in which the subjectivity has to linger and try to express its specificities. So in that sense, the common is, I will give you an example. In 2004, when we had this discussion in New York, I remember one thing which still stays with me, which was, you had asked, and it was actually prompted by a friend, and you pushed it, was that what happens to the intensely subjective premise of living in the sharing of the commons? Because we were very heavily into making argument of common continuously. So the question, what happens to the intensely subjective? So I think this pandemic circle is somewhere, it is kind of very confident of the common, but it is also knows that it shares the kind of textural and empathetic common. And taking that, it goes into the eye. The eye is, in the third video, eye is very fragmented. It keeps on moving between many eyes. And in the second video, it's a kind of one person, a friend said, a purgatory, a kind of a purgatory eye completely losing the hold on the language by which it is constructed. So in that sense, the common is there. Common is there in that stitching, in that braiding, simultaneous and breaking apart.
Thank you. Either one of you.
Yeah, I will just sort of think aloud on this sort of, Shuddha mentioned the Yokohama Triennial, but one of the sort of key ideas that we were working, and I will not go into a lot of detail, but the phrase is care with toxicity. So it was formulated actually before, much before the pandemic started. So it seemed kind of, it seemed like it was retrofitted, but that's not, so we were thinking on this question of care with toxicity as a question to the common in that sense, or to what does it mean to cohabit now into the future, right? That's the common as a principle that, as a principle of Pamphilos, or as a principle that you're talking about, as we've discussed, that's one, obviously the sort of the heart, the beating heart of it. But the question also remains is, there is the common, the willy-nilly common that emerges because of the fact that we have to cohabit, in that sense. What does it mean to live into the future where there is an awareness of how we go into it together? And one of the sort of ideas we were thinking on is the question of care with toxicity. The fact is that care we know, and I think this is what Jibish also was saying. The commons is now a ground. Like if one begins that as a starting ground, it is no longer an argument. It is a premise. And I think one of the things that the pandemic, for example, has again has reminded us that care is a premise. I mean, without care, there is. But also the fact that the care now has to take on the toxic. It is not possible to survive without the toxic. The toxic comes to us sometimes as sickness and sometimes as cure. Because let us not forget that, all our histories of vaccination or, so much depends also on the right amount of toxicity that you can take in. And there are other traditions of toxicity that are deeply problematic, such as the Indic civilizational sort of removing of even the shadow of those it considers impure. So there's histories of toxicity, and of course there's the environmental. But what does it mean to think on this future moment, our future common, as it were, where we have to take on board care with toxicity, and how does one live with an awareness of this between us?
Thank you, Monica.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, one of the things that we've learned during the pandemic, and we actually refer to it in the first video, 31 days, is that there is a quantum of the viral load on the planet. Mm-hmm. In early this year, it was a few nanograms, and then it has grown to a few milligrams, and it's gone to a few more milligrams. So the virus has actually used us as a commons to grow the entire human species. And that's something to learn from. It's like it has grown incrementally, And so now there's maybe about 9 milligrams of the virus on the planet. If we take all the virus particles and put them on a weighing scale, they would amount to something like 9 milligrams. I'm not sure of the exact figure, but those 9 milligrams have used us as a commons to grow. That makes me think that you can do that with other things. We come back to the question of language. An idea that has been really chasing itself in my head is that what if the alphabet, let's say the earliest alphabets, the Phoenician or whatever it is, the earliest phonetic alphabets, were prosthesis? What if they were actually invented by people who had problems speaking, like a cleft lip or something like that? Like, I mean, why else would you make a mark and say the, right? I mean, there must have been a reason as to why this must have suggested itself as a way of getting around the problem of being able to express a phonetic burst, let's say. So think of that first line, the aleph, which is like the first infection. And now think of all the books in our libraries in all the languages. It's a bit like the way in which the virus of the alphabet actually grew in the human species to enable itself to become something else, so that now we are inseparable from that virus, right? We cannot be ourselves anymore without being able to say is a straight line and the is a strange, figure of some sort. And that's a kind of commons. And it's a commons that if it were sequestered, as sometimes it has been, language has been sequestered occasionally, the languages that have been sequestered have become fossils and died. The reason why we are all speaking a colonizer's language is that because we in different parts of the world made English our own. It's no longer the colonizer's language, it's our language, right? I mean, all of us who are on this Zoom platform had ancestors who spoke languages other than English. But English became a commons between us because we made it that way. And I think that's a way of thinking about the commons, because often one has this kind of strange idea of the tragedy of the commons, that if so many people work on the commons, it gets depleted. But I think that one can learn from the virus something other than the tragedy of the commons.
Thank you, Siddha. So we actually have about 7 or 8 questions. And so in the interest of time, we have about 10 minutes or so, because we have some closing remarks. So can I ask that we will have each one of you maybe instead of all of you answering.
Instead of all of us here.
Yeah. So first question, I wonder how Raqs sees the interplay between the artistic practice and the curatorial practice. Do they have different approaches to each of these?
No, it is not different approaches. It's basically a different kind of emphasis, shifts ground and amplifies different way. So the artistic, the curatorial practice, in a very short way to say, is that the infrastructural interest in, like what Guna was saying, our infrastructural interest of continuously building up a relay and a kind of platforms and arenas, so that if it gathering arenas, platforms, mobile, kind of creates a mobile structure. So the curatorial allows that, which we practiced institutionally, quasi-institutionally in parts in last decade, now in this decade more curatorially. So in that sense, that aspect of our practice kind of grows. But the questions of time, the questions of kind of inquiries, they stay between the artistic and the curatorial in their own lingering way, moving between the two.
Thanks, Shivesh. The next one is for you, Monica. What is Monica's left hand or football reference? What is your equivalent of what they were referring to?
That's a nice question.
I just want to point out that there is one hand writing everything in all the films. Please focus on that hand. So yeah,
it's the calming hand, I guess.
All right, so
that's my right hand is my left hand.
All right. If possible, I wonder if Raqs could speak about how they interrogate and challenge the theme idea of extraction. in their work. And I'm thinking of the blood
Blood of Stars.
A lot of stars.
yes,
Stars.
both in terms of physical extraction and cultural extraction. Who wants to take that?
But,
Why don't you?
No, I vote. I'm voting Jibesh takes that question.
I'll take it.
No,
Sure,
see,
go
it's
ahead.
a very, now this is becoming a quick, like one of those quiz, 1 minute answers. So basically, concretely, sometimes while you're doing a work, you understand abstraction. Abstraction is a very complicated space, because, while we were doing work on commons and then the whole traditional knowledge, I understood, and we understood a lot that in software, and open free software was so central, and one of the biggest transfer of knowledge in human history has happened because of free software. All over the world it traveled. But if you take that same ethics into traditional knowledge and you say that one group, sacred grove, one practitioner, one group of people in some area kept some knowledge embodied within them, and then you want to extract pharmacologically and make it, maybe it is good for the whole of mankind and pharmacological expertise might grow, but you realize that mobilizing the language of common there is actually depriving a huge kind of a ecology and a cosmology of life. So, and now in the present, it becomes very difficult. So I think we live with a plurality of epistemic challenges to working with in culture and with material life. And that plurality becomes very contingent and becomes very collisionary at each point. So I think there is no general thing. What we do is that in each instance, we have to mobilize a lot more thinking now than finding a general principle for it.
Thanks, Jibesh. Okay, so please talk a little bit about the role of sound in these films. There is a drone that sounds like a tampura, and there is also a distortion-like sound. There is a weight in the soundtrack that make it hard to locate the place and sound. Place and space in which these videos are taking place. Maybe you could talk, one of you could talk about the role of sound in this work.
Yeah, it's nice to think about sound. Sound is the first sense to awaken and the last sense to die. It's possible that people who are dying hear more than we think. They may lose all their other senses, but sound still remains. And I think it's a very interesting, sound is a really interesting sense because it is actually a physical sensation, because these are particles hitting our eardrums. So that the question of a bass sound or a kind of bass note or a drone is a very fascinating one, because it's actually an admission about the nature of life. There is a drone wherever we are. When we were doing in film school, in our sound classes, we were always taught about room tone, right? You go into any room, it has a bass tone, and you have to find this. Our sound teacher used to say, you have to find the sweet spot. Now, these are ways of thinking about space, which actually are very spatial and very sensory, very somatic in a way. So I think that in our work, there's always an attention to this kind of subliminal effect of sound. We don't work with music, but we work with sound as tone, because I think that it actually produces somatic responses. And these works are, in a way, they're things to be heard with the headphone, right? So the sound experience, or the idea of what is ambient, is an intercranial ambience. It's the ambience is inside yours, between your ears, let's say. And I think that we weren't really conscious of that, but I think in the making of these films, and in listening to them repeatedly, and in some of the other work, we recently made a very layered labyrinthine work called Not Yet at Ease, which is made up of a kind of labyrinth of sort of soundproof material, but where sound itself is a whisper that travels as you move along, and it's a ghostly invocation of the dead of the First World War. But it's really the whisper, the drone, the hum, the what is it called? The things that you hear in your head when you have tinnitus, which are not really external but internal sound that I think we're working with.
Thanks, Shuddha. So the act of writing also evokes a sense of empathy. Can Raqs talk about the need for empathy and to be specific, collective empathy right now?
Yeah.
I
It's
think
in
some of
short
the things that or maybe
Or
not.
lots of it.
Or maybe.
Or maybe in the sense that I think some of the things that this ideas that, you know, the infrastructure or the gathering or the idea of the platform or arena, that's one way that we have in our own practice been trying to ask the question of what is it that one can create the zone of sharing. I mean, I think being a collective is a kind of a starting point where you have to create first something that is shared in between before you can even start to then say what is it that is shared in between. So the first principle is also, you know, the condition is also the idea, like you cannot separate the two. And I think questions of empathy are reaching again. I mean, that is the stasis that we go on about is perhaps one of those situations where the condition and the, you know, and the premise now have to be considered concomitant, and we cannot segregate the idea of empathy as a kind of extrinsic principle and sort of look at it as a kind of, you know, the room tone, the collective room tone, as it were.
Yeah.
Thanks,
You know,
Raqs.
that one concept that one concept that we have now suddenly erupted between us, and it's very interesting, is called the intimacy of revolts. You know, revolts are not grand. You know, suddenly in the last few months, you understood, and this is because Monica stayed very closely with Amalia, and Amalia, you know Amalia, you've seen.
Mm-hmm.
So Amalia is now 13. But you know, you can see that she has a different cosmology to life. And what is interesting is that, you know, and Stanley Cavell has this 20th century, the mother-daughter conversation changes the history of 20th century, so there is an intimacy of revolt that one suddenly understood this time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think more than empathy, I think this intimacy of revolt, that all revolts are intimate at some level, and that's what life churning is, to understand it and take it within oneself. And I think this would be more an understanding that we gathered. It suddenly came up in our writing between each other, and I think that is a good sign.
Yeah.
That's
and the other
empathy.
thing, I'll just say one thing is that there's a very interesting difference between empathy and sympathy. Where sympathy means that you feel the same thing that other people are feeling. You agree, your feelings agree with the feelings of others. But empathy does not require agreement. It requires an awareness and a sensitivity, which need not be agreement. And I think that that's a very crucial thing for us to understand about what the commons is. Commons is not a space of agreement alone.
Absolutely. Spoken like a true Marxist. Now, two more questions. Is there a cosmic grief marked out by our making of art, of memory? Is there a cosmic
grief?
A cosmic
grief.
Grief.
What's the second word? Grief, as in like sadness, that kind of grief.
Sadness, a cosmic grief marked out by our making of art, of memory. Is there a cosmic responsibility? Cosmic equals to social in its fullest cultural sense, a global commons, a world intersubjectivity. You can just say yes.
Yes, cosmos. The word cosmos is not just between us and what is beyond the Milky Way. A home is a cosmos. In Greece, cosmos, in Greek, cosmos is any environment. So yes, there is any relationship to an external space is a cosmic one. I'm a member of the Association of Autonomous Astronauts. We believe in space travel in all directions.
All right, one last question. Such a fabulous talk. I'm reading. Such a fabulous talk. The works refer to the persistent act of leaving a trace. Thus, as I understand it, you also define amnesia as a kind of defense mechanism. Could you elaborate on this tension?
Yeah, you know, if whoever is asking, I'm sure from South Asia. If you are from South Asia, one thing you have to understand is that it is a landscape where forgetting has a very specific, and we have not yet got the philosophical, phenomenological understanding of what is the status of forgetting here. But like partition, if like we lived with neighborhoods and neighborhoods of people, like Shuddha grew up, I grew up, Monica grew up, with histories of partition around us, but rarely uttered. It started getting uttered in 90s, and then when the present hunger, this people walking, you suddenly realize that there is a huge story of hunger in this society, of famine, starvation, and suddenly, and like India has overcome starvation, it is said, in that sense that you don't have famine conditions, you have persistence, but you have certain basic feed is available to all. But then you realize that there's a huge kind of hunger that is part of our memory, but not so. It is processing us, it is processing and recalling, but it is also part of the way of dealing, in a sense that amnesia is very much there. So it is a deeply charged philosophical question. I think many scholars will have to engage with it now in the coming times much more than ever.
Thank you,
because
Vivek.
Spanish flu didn't leave a single text in Indian subcontinent, and maximum people have died of it. So it's something that we have to really come to understand, why is it so, and what is the specificity of the way of thinking here that giving rise to this form of forgetting and recalling.
Thank you very much, everyone. So we are at time, and I wanted to, first of all, thank all of you for so generously sharing your work with all of us, and also sharing your ideas about your works today. And I will hand it over to Srimoyee to close.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guna, and thank you, Monica, Shuddha, and Jivesh. Thank you for really such an insightful conversation, from cosmologies and the intimacy of revolt to Maradona and stopping the flow of football, or soccer, I guess they say here. But so I just really want to say thank you. And it felt too short. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Great questions.